Hey guys, thanks for coming to the channel. Today we're going to continue my three-part series on crankbait fishing. The first one was square bills. The second one, the one we're going to discuss today, is mid-depth crankbaits. And then we're going to do a final one on deep crankbaits. And we're going to do a deep dive, no pun intended, into how to select the right crankbaits for the right situations. If you haven't seen my one on square bills, which I posted before this video, I'll post it right here. There's the link for it. You can go back and watch that. Watch this one first though. And if you watch my channel on a regular basis and you like what you see, please hit the subscribe button, like it, share it with your friends, put a comment in the bottom. It'll help grow the channel. Thanks again for that in advance. So let's get right into it. A mid-depth crankbait. What would a mid-depth crankbait be? Well, mid-depth crankbait is going to be a crankbait that dives somewhere between 7 foot to 12 or 13 foot. You know, everything down to maybe like a DT 14 would be the deepest edge on a mid-depth crankbait. And of course, once you get over 14 feet, you're into deep diving crankbaits. And then shallow running crankbaits will be, you know, generally 3 to 5 foot, but a little bit less than 7, usually on their deeper edge. And so when would you change to a mid-depth crankbait versus a square bill? Well, that's, you know, simply it's this, is that the fish are no longer active in shallow water for whatever reason. It's too hot, it's too cold, there's no bait up there, the water's gotten muddy on the bank from boat traffic. A lot of things can push the fish off of the bank where they may have been on the bank recently. And then when they're on the bank, you're generally going to want to throw, you know, a square bill in varying depths from, you know, 0 to 1 feet down to 5 or 6 feet even. So mid-depths come into play when these fish back off of the bank, or they're just set up now off of the bank, maybe on that first little drop off, that first little edge, the tips of blow down trees and structure. The outside edges of docks, pole docks, not floating docks, they tend to be deeper. The outside edge of pole docks, floating docks, they're down at the bottom of the riprap instead of up on the riprap. You know, things like this is when we want to concentrate on those fish with a mid-depth crankbait. And you know, they come in a lot of different shapes, sizes, and colors. You know, you can go to any fish and tackle store and man, you can almost get overwhelmed with the number of color, shapes, and sizes of crankbaits. So you can keep it really simple. You need something natural, you need something crawfish, and you need something that is natural-ish but will show up in dirty water, and then you need something that just shows up in dirty water. You know, the shape of the bill and the placement on the front of the lure is going to dictate its action and its depth. You know, if you have a lure like this DT6 here, which would be, you know, like bottom edge, it'll run about 7 feet on 10-pound line. It has a small rounded lip. It has a tight wiggle because it is a flat body. And this is a realistic bait, obviously a shad bait. So you're going to want to use this type of bait when the fish are relatively shallow, but not too shallow. They're around shad and the water's clear. And then you have a bait like this fritz side bait. It has actually a very small lip. You know, it's a kind of a different shaped lip. It's kind of a hybrid lip between a square bill and a diving crankbait. And generally, this is a fritz side 7. Generally, this type of bait with that bill wouldn't generally get to about 7 foot deep. But what the fritz side does is, if you can see here on the front, they have weights in here. This is a wood bait, so it would float otherwise. They have weights in the front here that get this bait down deeper. So what you get with this bait compared to the other bait, this is a tight wiggle. This is even a tighter wiggle. But it's hard to find a good tight wiggle bait that runs in that 7 to 8 foot range, you know, without going with a lipless bait or something like that, something that you can sink. So fritz side has accomplished that with weighting these thin baits to get the tight wiggle at that depth where those fish are not used to seeing a lot of times. And then you have, of course, you know, your more rounded baits like this old wiggle wart. When you look at the bill on this wiggle wart, it has a scoop shape to it, and the bill comes almost straight off of the head. So generally, the straighter off the head that the bill comes on a crankbait, the more the bait's going to want to go like this, which means it's going to dive as deep as it can dive for the range that it's in. But it does something else too. When it's down like this, digging, it's, you know, that bill is acting as a weed guard, blocking you from getting snagged. Whereas a bait that runs more on a 45 or even flat through the water is going to get snagged way easier than one that has that bill sticking straight off the front, and it won't dive as deep for the size. Here's a DT10. Now that DT10, the bill is, you know, pretty much straight off the front again. It's a big rounded scoop bill. It's a rounded body. This bait has, you know, kind of an in-between wobble. This bait has not a tight wobble, but it doesn't, you know, really wobble wide like some of these more rounder baits. It's kind of an in-between bait. And that's a bait that you may want to use on occasion. Then you have old standby baits like this old Bandit 200. Has a rounded bill, dives to about 7 or 8 feet, and it's probably has one of the smaller body sizes of baits in this category. And so what does that mean? That means it's going to get you a lot of bites. You know, Bandit 200 is one of the bite gettingest crankbaits there is, you know, that mid-depth range, and it's just a matter of adjusting the color and the speed and the presentation for what you're trying to achieve. So you want to alter the depth of your bait with the depth that you're trying to fish. And when you do that, you know, you want your bait to go a little bit deeper than what you're actually trying to fish. If you're trying to hit that brush pile in 7 and 8 foot of water, you probably want a bait that runs 9 or 10 feet deep. You know, if you're trying to hit those rocks in 10 feet of water, you probably want a bait that runs about 11 or 12 feet deep. You want it to run a little bit deeper than what you're actually trying to fish. A crankbait is least effective when it is just swimming through the water without hitting anything, deflecting off of anything. So you want it to beat and bang on the bottom or into the brush piles or dock pilings if you're throwing around dock pilings, things like that, or rip wrap. You want it in there. If you're just coming back clean each time with it and you're not hitting anything, you don't have the right crankbait tied on. You may catch a fish on it, but you're not optimizing your chances of catching the most fish. So let's talk about colors again. You know, we talked about colors and square bills, and it doesn't change a whole lot with mid-depth range baits, except there's one thing to be, you know, mindful of with mid-depth baits, is that the deeper you go, the less light penetration you have, so generally the brighter your bait needs to be. That's why you see with most deep diving baits, you see very few, you know, natural color deep diving baits. There are almost always some painted with some chartreuse or green or blue back, something like that, because that's what these fish can find in the deeper depths. But in the mid depth, you know, it's going to depend on, you know, the clarity of the water and the actual depth that you're fishing. You know, if you're fishing 6 or 7 feet in clear water, you're probably going to want as natural a bait as you can get. You know, something like this little DT shad, you know, and that's going to work best, you know, on sunny days. This has the reflective foil coating on it. It's going to work best on sunny days, and then when you get into more cloudy days under clear water conditions, you may go with a painted type, natural type bait. Now this one will also work good in dingy water because it's painted. And you know, dingy water is the next thing we need to consider. In dingy water, you know, you want more solid colors. You know, slightly dingy water, you're going to be more want whites and, you know, maybe light yellows and things like that. And then once you get in dirtier water, you're going to go to chartreuses and reds, or bright mixes of red and yellow and orange, chartreusey, things like that. So you want to change that depending on your watercolor and your depth. So once you get to a certain depth, you know, once the water gets to a certain dirtiness, you know, crankbaits offshore are not going to be what you're going to even want to throw anyhow. So once you get into muddy type water, you know, a crankbait that's running, you know, deeper than 7 or 8 feet is there's probably nothing in that depth range that's going to be feeding. It's going to be dormant at best. In muddy water situations, you know, these fish are going to move shallow, most of the time less than 5 feet, and even if it's not scalding hot, you know, they'll be, you know, as shallow as 1 or 2 feet a lot of times. And you know, a crankbait might not even be your best tool in that situation. So red, when you're around a bunch of crawfish, or early in the spring when the water's dirty, red seems to have a little magic pull to it for whatever reason. Then you want your Chartreuses, when you're dealing with dingy to dirty water, not particularly mud water, but dingy to dirty water. Sometimes we even bite this in clear water because they get in weird moods, but generally that's what that would be for. And then you want your natural colors, baby bass, shad, painted shad, you know, when you're in clearish water where the fish are going to be more tuned into realism. And the level of paint versus no paint and foil is going to depend on, you know, how clear it is and what level of color you have to your water. More natural for super clear, less natural, more painted for the dingy you go down to bright colors. You know, you can make it real simple on yourself with crankbait fishing. Instead of having 30, 40 different color, shapes, and styles of crankbaits, you need to have crankbaits to hit the depths that you're after. But as far as colors and styles go, you know, something shad, something chartreusey, and something red, red brown, red orange, and you got the bases covered on color. A whole bunch of little tweaks on colors aren't going to make a big difference in your catch rate. As long as you have those general colors covered, you'll be able to approach the fish with the right tool for the right job, depending on what's available in your body of water. So what equipment do you need for mid-depth crankbaits? It's pretty much the same as with square bill crankbaits. You know, most mid-depth crankbaits, you know, 7 to 12, 13, 14 foot, are going to be reasonably smallish type crankbaits. They're not going to weigh a lot. They're not going to, you know, you're not going to need a big rod, long rod, a reel that holds a lot of line for long casts with them, because you're just not going to make extremely long casts with these lighter mid-depth type crankbaits, these wiggle warts and these bomber 6As, smaller type mid-depth range crankbaits. So for me, I'm pretty much exclusively going to throw a mid-depth crankbait on a 6'6" moderate action rod, probably a fiberglass rod, but I have used, you know, they make some graphite rods that have a good moderate action now, but most of the time a fiberglass rod. In 6'6", I'm going to throw it on a 6-something to 1 reel. Again, I don't like the 5-something's too slow for these crankbaits. The 7's too fast. It tends to want to hang your baits up when you get around brush and things like that, because you're moving the bait a little bit too fast. And then I like I said, with my square bills, I'm going to throw 10-pound P-line almost always. The only time I'm not going to throw 10-pound P-line on mid-depth crankbait is if the water is ultra clear and I really need to get maybe another foot or so of depth out of the bait that I'm throwing. You know, I got one that dives to 8 feet on P-line, but it may go to 9 or 10 on fluorocarbon. I may change the fluorocarbon, and again, it'll probably be 10-pound fluorocarbon. I'm not going to change the test on that at all, but generally that P-line is going to cover the bases. So that's your rod, your reel, and your line that'll, you know, take care of almost every situation with a mid-depth crankbait. You know, I have to say, I think the mid-depth crankbait for most people is the most ignored crankbait out there. People love their square bills and they love their deep divers, but there's so many times in between, you know, in between pre-spawn and spawn and post-spawn before they get out deep, and in the fall when fish are, you know, starting to move shallow again, or when they're setting up on points, you know, to ambush bait that's moving in for the fall, where these mid-depth crankbaits are going to be the right crankbait for those situations. Understand all of these things I'm talking about here with mid-depth crankbaits. Tie them on with the right equipment. Go out, go after the fish, and you will catch more fish and be a better fisherman. Again, thanks for watching, and have a blessed day.